Just sort of a brief disclaimer. I'm going to attempt to raise some questions and bring up some issues. I don't really have any answers, or I have some thoughts and considerations, but by and large, I feel like there's a lot of discussions that aren't taking place within sort of the mainstream or more popular, accessible psychedelic discourse, and I'd kind of like to take a moment and highlight some of those. That'll basically be the intention of this talk, rather than proposing wholesale solutions, because ultimately I think it's going to come down to things that people in this community can put forward together rather than any sort of individual dictate. So with that said, I just want to be clear, everything I'm about to say is basically mired in and focused on the US context. There's a number of reasons for that. First is that the US presents a hypertrophied example of the effects of prohibition. By that, I mean that we are well beyond what you see in most other industrialized countries as far as our opposition to sensible drug policy. So we see this in the repeal of needle exchange programs. We see this in the treatment of substance problems as criminal problems rather than health issues. We see this in our mass incarceration, largely of Black, brown, and poor people. It's kind of outrageous and completely out of control. Additionally, when we look at the global context, we see that waning American hegemony is essentially an inescapable reality of international politics. We see this in increasing deployment of hard power around the globe in the form of military interventions, in the form of supposedly non-military aid interventions that essentially serve the same purpose, and a variety of other policies. Additionally, looking specifically at things like nuclear nonproliferation and approaches to climate change, the US is regarded as one of the greatest threats to world peace, contrary to US attempts to label that as Iran. We also have the manufacture of consent. By that, we're certainly not alone in that realm, but by that I mean that paying attention to what is being said or not said in the media, we see that there's a very limited framework of what is considered left-wing, right-wing, mainstream ideologies. And often I would state that the things that go unsaid within mainstream political discourse are much more important than what actually appears in print and how it's discussed. And finally, the US context is what I'm familiar with, so it's easier that way. Basically, I'd like to take a brief snapshot of our current situation. Psychedelics don't exist in a vacuum. Contrary to a lot of claims about the importance of lab and institutional work, I think that ultimately we have to recognize that there are social and political implications of pretty much everything that happens with psychedelics. There is no divorcing them from the social fabric. There is no divorcing them from day-to-day life. There is no pretending like they don't have ripples and implications for all of us. Ultimately, when we consider the aspects of dominant culture, such as political institutions, we see that there's no escaping the way that these things function. So, for example, recently I was on a flight, it got grounded, we had an 8-hour layover, and somebody started elaborating on the fact that Donald Trump's immigration policies have been horrendous. When I pointed out that Obama had deported more immigrants than any president prior to him, including, and Trump as well, he denied that and said that there was no way that was right. We Googled it and found out that that was not the case, that in fact Obama holds the clear record. So it seems like many people focus on individuals, focus on specific examples, and sort of lose sight of the systemic nature of things. We see that as well with the focus of individual interventions in the biomedical model. We have to understand that many of the systems and institutions that exist are structured to function in the manner that they do, and that people who are at the reins are simply the actors driving these things in the ways that they're designed to function. So when we see the expansion of the surveillance state, it doesn't matter who's at the helm, the surveillance state is designed to surveil. Similarly with incarceration and other systemic forms of domination. When we look at capitalism, there's no escaping the fact that this is the dominant sociopolitical paradigm and economic model. So when we see investors and entrepreneurs and people like that in Silicon Valley engaged in discourse around turning psychedelics into nootropics, specifically looking at LSD and the recent fascination with the manners in which perhaps this can be changed from a boundary-dissolving compound that presents significant threats to the dominant social order, and instead a way of maximizing developer creativity, thereby squeezing as much profit as possible out of new apps. I think that raises a really serious cause for concern. Similarly, when we look at the effects of industrial civilization and ongoing ecocide, and then examine certain individuals who fly down to the Amazon, engage in various rituals, and then return to extol the manner in which these plants and compounds may bring the world together, while at the same time they're running corporations that are essentially resting on the backs of ecocide, exploitation, and a whole variety of other problematic systems, we see that there's an inherent contradiction in their assertions. And ultimately, there's no attempt to reconcile these because, frankly, it's all bullshit. And then when we look at issues of specifically American imperialism and militarism, as I highlighted in a little bit of that debate with Doblin the other night, there's no escaping the fact that supplying the military with various compounds, even if we're focusing on individual interventions, has impacts in a social sense. There's no escaping the way that these things ripple out beyond their intended clinical and pharmaceutical applications. So with that said, the medical model is currently the dominant approach to legalizing psychedelics. It's understandable that it doesn't really focus on any sort of cultural issues or social ripples and implications, because ultimately that's not the path to legalization. That is a much more complex problem that ultimately would put them at odds, I believe, in various ways with government institutions and would not present a viable means to regulation, legalization, and the application of these therapies in a social context. Again, completely understandable given their goals. And ultimately, just focusing on that rescheduling and legalization, I think creates a number of blind spots. It also creates the notion that there can be such a thing as the apolitical use of psychedelics. Frankly, I don't think that's possible. When we look at politics and understand it to be power relations, the way that we associate with each other, how we decide to organize in society and around society, we see that ultimately everything is political. In looking at some 60 years of psychedelic exploration and participation in the community, specifically outside of a lab context, we come across a number of themes. Now, without intending to essentialize the psychedelic or a psychedelic experience, I'd like to point out that notions like ecological integrity, senses of oneness, allness, togetherness, love pervading everything, like there's a reason that some of these things are cliches and identified with psychedelic use. Now, given the fact that these themes seem to be fairly common over a fairly established history, I think that if we contrast these things with the societies in which we live in, if we contrast these things with multi-billion-dollar ad campaigns that are designed to tell us that we're unlovable, that we lack the things that would make us whole until we buy them from the marketplace, that until we participate as good little consumers, we are lacking some fundamental quality of what it means to be human, we see that applying psychedelic insight in society within these dominant frameworks presents inherently political projects. Those things clash. There's no way around that. There is no integrating them into society without fundamentally changing what those implications mean. With that said, the way psychedelics crop up in the media is rather significant. This was a quote that appeared in Playboy this past year, stating, "One of the big mistakes of the 1960s was people identifying as the counterculture. When the crackdown happened, psychedelics got wrapped up with the Cultural Revolution. When you self-identify as part of the counterculture, you check yourself out of things, you kind of marginalize yourself. You don't ask the system to grow and change." Now, first and foremost, it's easy to demonstrate that that's simply not true in a historical context. Whether we look at the role of abolition groups in ending slavery, if we look at anarchists in the American labor movement, if we examine the Black Power movement, American Indian movement, Black Lives Matter, students movement, and women's liberation movements, it's really an endless cacophony of stories that run counter to that narrative. Beyond that, if we ask, was the 60s counterculture a mistake, we have to ask if it's a meaningful question. Ultimately, I don't think it is. Partly because it doesn't actually advance any sort of nuanced critique. It doesn't present what aspects were mistakes, why they were mistakes, what the actual strategies or tactics were, what they were aiming to achieve. If we look at what some of these countercultural movements achieved in the 60s, we see that it had a tremendously civilizing effect on American society. This is true specifically if we look at the women's movement, the students' movement, and the civil rights movement. It also raises questions of the morality of things like Vietnam, right? If opposition to the war and countercultural action in that context was a mistake, where do you come down on that? What should intervention have looked like? Should there have been intervention? Should the US have been allowed to carry on unchecked by a populace that overwhelmingly believed it was a moral atrocity? So ultimately, we arrive at the implicit assertion that either psychedelic users were wrong to express their political dissidence, or political dissidents were mistaken in their use of psychedelics. Given the way in which these things fit together, I think that's clearly not the case, further underscoring, to my mind, the absurdity of this quote. As I've already underscored, there's a reason that psychedelics and radical politics can coexist and have frequently shared space over the past decades. And ultimately, at the end of the day, drug users aren't responsible for the political operators and the decisions they make, the way that they choose to repress us and come after us. This is particularly telling if we look at this quote by John Ehrlichman, who was an advisor to Nixon, who stated, "The Nixon campaign in '68 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So there they are telling you in their own words that they had no intention of allowing these particular groups to exist. And this comes back to issues of criminality. This comes back to the fact that I think one of the problems that exists in the psychedelic and cannabis community is this refusal to accept that we are criminals. We are criminals, and that puts us in solidarity with a number of other criminalized communities. And I think it's important to recognize those bonds that we have and act accordingly. So given that, it raises the question of what legacies exist. Ultimately, with regards to the earlier quotes, the '60s happened. They laid the foundation both for psychedelic research as it stands today, as well as various other projects that have taken place since then. I think we have to understand that prohibition of drugs isn't actually about drugs, it's about social control. It's about the incarceration of surplus populations. It's about ultimately keeping the dominant paradigm functioning in a manner that is conducive and to the benefit of a very small group of people. Ultimately, I think we need to understand that drug use, specifically psychedelics, can and did catalyze political action, and I think that it's something that's currently lacking. I think that there's a lot of critique that could be leveled. I think there's a shocking dearth of structural analysis in this community, and frankly, I'd like to see more of it. And I think that when it comes to this fear of repeating the mistakes of the '60s, a lot of the people that are espousing that sentiment have a really poor idea of what the mistakes were, or are simply unwilling to articulate it and get into real debate about it. Which brings me to the final point in that sense, which is that there is a lack of social and political debate within the psychedelic community. And I don't know if that's because people are afraid to upset other people. I don't know if that's because people feel that we all use drugs, so we're all on the same side. But for whatever reason, I think it's really hampering some of the discussion that needs to take place. So when the question of mainstreaming psychedelics comes up, I think that there's a variety of questions that need to ultimately be thrown back in its face. First is why? What is the goal of mainstreaming psychedelics? What do we consider the mainstream? And why is it important to extend psychedelics to them? What are the effects of mainstreaming psychedelics? Do we see this becoming ultimately recuperated by the dominant culture in ways that turn it into little more than a chic new consumer trend? Ultimately, the question becomes, is it disruptive and to whom? Do we see these potentials for catalyzing change in society? Do we see potentials for mitigating some of the harm that is clearly taking place and for which we have significant evidence has been taking place for the past decades since psychedelics were first encountered and began to spill into public consciousness? Ultimately, we also have to ask who sets the agenda? Who gets to control what mainstream looks like? Who gets to control who has access to mainstream? Who controls who distributes, who produces, and who regulates these compounds in a mainstream context? And ultimately, we have to ask if mainstreaming psychedelics actually improves our situation on this planet as humans. And if so, how? Again, there's the need for that structural critique. There's the need for the analysis of these institutions and systems. And if we can't actually show that psychedelics and mainstreaming psychedelics offers something more than the propagation of a culture that essentially just looks to make the newest technological trinkets to keep us all engaged with whatever sort of distraction is happening at the moment, in order to ultimately drive profit and resource extraction and other problematic components of this dominant culture. I think we have to ask, is it a meritorious project? So ultimately, by radical psychedelic engagement, I simply mean turning psychedelic insight into practice. I think most people in this room have had experiences that have brought them closer to other people, to nature, to things that seem worthwhile. I would hope that, at the risk of essentializing things, to things that touch on what it means to be human, on what it means to get to have these sort of deeper, meaningful experiences and participate in reality, life, and existence on Earth. If we can't turn that insight into practice, I don't really know what purpose it serves. I mean, it's certainly a nice experience, and you could certainly argue that it doesn't have to serve a purpose, but it seems to me kind of lamentable if it doesn't serve a purpose. Additionally, I think we have to figure out ways in which to leverage that insight and practice into ways that affect meaningful change. I hear a lot of comments about how, if only enough people were able to take psychedelics, then the whole world would change. We frequently encounter on the Nexus people who've just had a DMT experience who say, oh my God, I want to run a 5 kilogram, 10 kilogram extraction and turn everyone on, because once everyone has this experience, they'll realize that we have to do things differently. But none of that engages with the actual realities of what it takes to maintain systems of domination and control, what it takes to prop up the mass incarceration of the United States, what it takes to maintain American military power around the world. The way in which these things function have long, destructive histories. One of the things, to touch back on criminality, in the US, the police they trace a straight line from southern slave catchers and northern city watches that were ultimately tasked with determining what was criminal in an attempt to keep out undesired classes. This isn't something where there's a few bad actors that are going after certain people. This is something that is entrenched at its very core, notions of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of domination and subjugation. And unless there's actual engagement with the components that these systems rely on and that are entrenched in most industrial Western so-called nations, we're not going to see much change regardless of how many psychedelics we take, in my opinion. And ultimately, I think we have to ask what kind of world we want to live in. We have to ask, do we want to live in a society where psychedelics are legal, but ultimately they serve as little more than distractions, little more than therapies, which isn't to say that therapies are problematic in and of themselves, but I don't necessarily know that it makes sense to incorporate these things in quiet, non-disruptive, peaceful little ways when we look at a system around the world that presents so much suffering to so many. That's not to say that I think we can do away with suffering entirely or that we have some sort of hope of building a utopic future, but rather that without questioning where we're going with these projects, without actually questioning how they get applied and what the actual intended outcome is, I think we run the risk of just running down the road and sort of throwing whatever sticks at the wall or whatever we hope might stick on the wall in an attempt to get practical access to these for ourselves, to try to avoid prison, to try to be able to have so-called safer spaces for use and engagement with these things. And frankly, it seems to me that there's a lot more that these things have to offer. Thank you.
I want to quickly go back to what you said at the start about the US being sort of at the epicenter of the worst manifestations of the drug war, but at the same time, your country's leading the way in cannabis legalization and in psychedelic research. My sort of analysis of that is down to like a certain kind of US individualism, which can facilitate cannabis legalization and psychedelic research through your culture of philanthropy. To what extent do you think that US individualist strain or whatever it is, how deep is that? And to what extent do you see in the future a role for government funding of this sort of stuff to counter this neoliberal philanthropy that's going on? Do you see that happening on a state level or a federal level? And where's that going to go in terms of the division that is rife in your country? And
small question, huh? So I guess the first thing that I would say, just with a quick note on some of the cannabis legalization, I think it's really problematic if we look at some of the states that have legalized, right, where we have large numbers of people that are still incarcerated that are serving time for that, while generally wealthier, whiter folks are now making bank off the back of that same product. We also have, like, having been to Oregon and Washington, having friends who own dispensaries, like, I think it's kind of alarming when you walk in and you see how slick the packaging is, how slick the advertising is. Like, people are pouring big bucks into this, and folks are coming into, if we want to call it the community, right? Like, people who've never had engagement with cannabis are now pushing it in a big way because they recognize the profit potential there. And I think whether or not it's in sort of the American individualistic, sense, whether we're talking about psychedelic therapies or we're talking about cannabis or we're talking about participation with moving those things towards legalization, I think the thing that's going to drive that in the US is demonstration of profit potential, demonstration of budgetary components. So I in that context, like, I think we would be more likely to see things popping off at the state level, where perhaps states that have large military bases and see, oh, if single-use ketamine or MDMA therapies have these really beneficial potentials to our troops, can cut down on VA costs, can ultimately save taxpayers money, I could see some push in that direction towards legalization. As far as what state funding looks like or governmental funding, I have no clue, largely because of the degree to which they're focused on stripping any sort of anything resembling a social safety net. I mean, it's just such a fundamentally different paradigm.
So, as psychonauts, we are faced with two demons. One is misinformation, and the other is the media. And they both often walk around the field hand in hand. We are vastly outnumbered in terms of non-psychonauts from psychonauts. So how do we, as I'm assuming responsible users, how do we tell people out there that this is not that thing that you're seeing on the news? This is actually something deeper.
To whatever degree it's an intervention, it may not be on the scale that you're thinking, but I mean, ultimately share the experiences, share the plants, share the compounds. I mean, the beauty of the psychedelic experience is that it's an experience. You can't take that away from someone. Once they have that experience, once they have that insight, there's no way to come along and say, hey, you didn't encounter that. That wasn't real. That was artifice. That was, I mean, right? Like, I mean, I've certainly encountered people who've tried to say, oh, that was just a drug-addled state. Or as Eric was just talking about, like, those notions where it's just like undeniably realer than real, more significant than whatever else happens. And so I think passing on that engagement to people who are open to it, to people who are looking for it, to people who I think would ultimately turn around and then pass that on even more, I mean, I think that has to be the project.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.